Udit, you're not audible, I think. Uh, so what we can do is,
Hello,
I,
hello.
yeah, you're audible now.
Okay, fine. I'll start again.
Yes, okay.
Hi everyone. I Udit Gupta will like to welcome you all to the third day of Let's Talk About Sex, which is brought to you by IMAMSN Maharashtra, SNO, AMSA, Asian Medical Student Association, Indian Safe Abortion Youth Advocates and Agents of ISH. Today we will be talking about unplanned pregnancies and signs of pregnancy, abortions, medical, legal and social aspects and post-abortion care. And the third aspect will be adoption. So, for discussing these, we have two speakers on behalf of Indian Safe Abortion Youth Advocates, Shweta Poreval and Zainab Engineer. Shweta is a final year medical student from Grant Medical College, Mumbai, and she has worked extensively in the field of sexual and reproductive health and writes with multiple organizations over the last 3 years. She has specifically worked in the field of abortion rights and access issues with India Safe Abortion Youth Advocates and envisions a world where everyone's sexual and reproductive rights, including the right to safe abortions, are realized and fulfilled. Zanab is a core team member of Indian Safe Abortion Youth Advocates and is a final year medical student from Grant Medical College, Mumbai. And she has worked with ICE over the last 3 years to further the advocacy for safe abortions with a human right based perspective. She hopes that her work will sensitize the medical students to this issue and contribute to creation of better healthcare experiences for abortion seekers in the future. Over to you guys. You can continue. Zanab and Shweta, you may start, guys.
Okay. Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Hi everyone. My name is Shweta, and I'm working with ISA, and we're going to be talking today about unintended pregnancies, the way forward. So, just before we begin, just a little disclaimer kind of thing on the importance of language. Just some kind of things to be careful about, and it'll be nice if everyone is a bit more sensitive about these terms. So the first thing is, when we say like when we're referring to someone who's pregnant, let's try to stay away from words like mother and father when talking about a pregnant person, unless they already have a child who has been born. Just because using the terms like mother and father imply that there is a child, which is not actually accurate, because it's a fetus, and until it's born, it's not really a child. And using terms like mother, father, parent ends up being used a lot of times to guilt trip people about whatever decision they make. So that's why, instead of that, a more neutral term that we will use is pregnant person. Apart from this, there is another similar term that we're going to avoid, which is calling a fetus a baby or a child. Uh, am I still not audible? Is it better now?
Yes, Shweta, go ahead.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So regarding calling a fetus or an embryo or a product of conception a baby, just because, again, that kind of gives the impression that people who are pregnant have a baby growing in them, while this is not actually true. It takes a whole 9-month period for pregnancy to happen, and after that a child is brought into the world. But until then, the person the products of conception are a fetus. So we'll try to stay away from these language that is often used by anti-choice people to guilt people about the decisions that they're making. Similarly, one more term to just be a little bit more inclusive is to avoid saying pregnant woman when we're talking about, issues of unintended pregnancies, unless it's an actual woman that we are talking about, because pregnancy and unintended pregnancies are not just a woman's issue. We saw on the first day how, there can be people who are not identifying as women who may get pregnant as well if they still have, their reproductive organs and they've not transitioned. So instead of saying pregnant woman, again, we would refer to a pregnant person as a pregnant person, just so that we're being more inclusive in the language. So that said, I will dive right into what an unintended pregnancy exactly is and how unintended pregnancy is, like, why would they happen and stuff like that. So the first thing is about the basics of unintended pregnancies. So a lot of times, although people have tried to kind of figure out why unintended pregnancies happen, the reasons for it and stuff like that, the conventional approach to, trying to classify the reasons why people get pregnant or why people don't get pregnant, it doesn't actually capture the fact that every person can have their own unique reason for wanting or not wanting a pregnancy. And that could be the situation of pregnant individuals or couples. And each person experiences different situations, different, they might be at different places in their life. And therefore, there is no blanket statement for why a pregnancy might be unintended. There could be a huge variety of reasons, and we need to be super careful about all of that. Then, when we talk about unintended pregnancies, usually a synonymous word to unintended pregnancies is unplanned pregnancies. So unintended or unplanned pregnancies are pregnancies that are usually referred to pregnancies that are mistimed. That means that they're simply happening earlier than they're actually desired to happen. And it may occur because of either not using contraceptives, or because of ineffective use of contraceptives, or just because, the quality of the contraceptive was poor, or whatever reason, it could lead to a mistimed pregnancy. What's really important to realize is that the concept of a pregnancy being unintended is different from a concept of a pregnancy being unwanted or wanted. So while a pregnancy may be unintended, that it was not intended to happen, it could become a wanted pregnancy, or it could become an unwanted pregnancy as well, depending on that person's choice. And it's really important to focus on the intentions, on, what the pregnant person wants to do, because only if when that person is allowed to, do what they actually want to do, can we actually focus on, fulfilling this whole need for what people can do with unintended pregnancies. So the problem is that when people have a pregnancy that is unintended, whatever the decision, I mean, even if it was an intentional pregnancy, people around the world struggle and face a lot of barriers when it comes to put these intentions into practice. When I say put them into practice, I'll explain to you shortly what the different options are. But basically, when people are trying to put their intentions into practice, there are a lot of obstacles because there's lack of contraception. So even if the person doesn't intend to get pregnant because they don't have knowledge about contraception or cannot access contraception, they cannot actually, prevent that pregnancy that they did not want to have in the first place. Or if there's just lack of access to healthcare services or lack of control over their own bodies, and there can be various reasons why a pregnancy can be unintentional. When we call it unwanted is if a pregnancy is that the pregnant person decides is undesired. So you see how that would be different from an unintentional pregnancy, where the person did not intend to get pregnant, but once they get pregnant, they can decide then whether or not they want the pregnancy or do not want the pregnancy. So both intended and unintended pregnancies can become wanted or unwanted pregnancies. So an example of an intended pregnancy, for example, that is wanted is probably the reason why most of us are born today, that it was an intentional pregnancy and it was a wanted pregnancy. An intentional pregnancy becoming unwanted could occur in the case of, maybe if there's any harm to the health of the fetus or the pregnant person that ends up happening, then maybe the pregnancy would become unwanted, because then, it's causing more harm than, good. So that is how an intended pregnancy can become unwanted. And now we'll talk to you more about how unintended pregnancies can transform into wanted or unwanted pregnancies as well. Yeah. So generally, to help individuals or couples to kind of achieve pregnancy, it's very essential to understand what their intentions are with pregnancy. And this basically means that they need to have a reproductive life plan. Now, it's not like the kind of plan that you sit down and plan out, like properly, but it's basically just the intentions that the person has with their reproductive life in the future. So it could be their own goals about becoming pregnant, the number, even if that number is 0, it is still a reproductive plan. The desired timing of when they want to have, their children, and the spacing of those children. So that entire process refers to their reproductive plan. And if a pregnancy happens out of sync with this reproductive plan, that is when it is called an unintended or an unplanned pregnancy. So I hope that kind of clarifies what an unintended pregnancy is. Moving on to what a person who is faced with an unintended pregnancy can do. So there are 3 major options that we talk about usually. The first is to carry the pregnancy to term and to parent the future child. That is, they decide to, have the child and become parents. So that is the first option. The second one is to place the baby for adoption. Of course, that would mean carrying the pregnancy to term as well. And the third thing is to have an abortion to end the pregnancy. So these are 3 different kind of methods or options that pregnant people kind of have in order to decide or choose what they wish to do when faced with an unintended pregnancy. Now, of course, each of these options people have a lot of different ethical and moral opinions about. And these opinions are often they are being built upon as we are growing as individuals. So these are based on values, these are based on religion, they're based on culture, they're based on, what the family says, what society thinks. It's based on so many different things that our own opinions about each of these options are kind of built up. What we are here to explain to you today is some basic things related to this, and what different options are for different people with this. So deciding which of these options to go for, and remember that all 3 of these options are extremely and equally valid options. There is no option that is better than the other. So deciding which option to go for can be difficult, and it is really important that when faced with an unintended pregnancy, pregnant people are empowered with accurate information and evidence-based information about each of these options so that they can make informed decisions, that they're aware of their own capacities or limitations for each of these options. For example, is there a law that governs it that would make it difficult for me to access it? Or would any of these options continuing with it be a bit more expensive? To know all of that, for them to be able to consider each of those choices, not just as choices in general, but choices for themselves, and then choose how they can act and choose one of those 3 options. For them to be able to make a decision about, the pregnancy, whether it's unintended, whether it's wanted, whether it's unwanted. And this should be done free from any sort of coercion. So no one should be able, pregnant people should be able to make that decision without anyone, interfering with their ability to make this choice. And ultimately, no matter which of those 3 options they choose, for them to be able to access and be provided the highest possible standards of healthcare in whatever decision that they make. So this is how ideally any of the options should be, whichever one the pregnant person chooses to continue with. What are the factors involved when we talk about unintended pregnancy? So why would a pregnancy kind of become unintended, what would kind of govern the next steps? This depends on 3 different things. The first is personal attitudes. So when we talk about personal attitudes, it depends on the individuals' beliefs, their values, their own choice about what they wish to do with their bodies. And this is the most important thing. After this, people also consider, when considering the 3 options, They also consider things like access to resources. So whether or not they will be able to access those services, or whether they will have support in whichever decision they choose to go with, what their financial situation is, which governs this which governs their access to these services. um, Depending on the partner with whom they became pregnant with, because say for example they choose to continue the pregnancy, is that the person you would envision raising a child with, even if not being in a relationship with, things like that. And of course other factors like housing and education. And finally, the visualization of the future, the ability to visualize themselves as a parent, or the ability to navigate life with a child versus how one expected their life to be without this child, and the visualization of what their future, children's life as well could be. So, all of these things kind of affect how people make decisions. If we had to look at the reasons why people opt for, like why people experience unintended pregnancies, or why a pregnancy can become unintended, there can be various things. The first and most important reason to recognize is choice. That a pregnancy might be unintended just because out of pure choice they did not intend for the pregnancy to happen at that time. The pregnancy can be an unintended pregnancy because of economic hardship, where they did not intend for the pregnancy to happen and for a child to be born at the end of 9 months. It could be because of an unhealthy partner relationship. It could be just because they had a different plan, the visualization that I just spoke about, that did not involve having a child at all. It could be healthcare issues affecting the fetus or the pregnant person. It could be a lack of support with continuing the pregnancy that they envision. It could be social stigma associated with the age or the context of the pregnancy or the pregnant person. So if the person is very young, there is definitely social stigma associated with young people getting pregnant, especially if they are unmarried. Or if they're very old, there is also that kind of stigma that exists, that, like by now you should have finished your family and you're still pregnant. And there's a lot of judgment. So people would rather not have a pregnancy than deal with that stigma. Of course, if the reproductive plan has already been met and the family is complete. And finally, changing family norms, where we are moving to smaller nuclear family structures. And all of these are reasons why a pregnancy could be unintended and then, not wanted in the future. Of course, it's very important to remember that these are just some of the reasons why a pregnancy can be unwanted or unintended. It in no way represents the complexities of which the complexities of a pregnant person's situation, what their desires are, what their experiences are prior to the pregnancy. I mean, these are just some situations. Or what is the context in which they had the pregnancy that leads them to deciding that the pregnancy is unintended. So these are just some reasons, but there can be a whole variety of reasons, and these reasons can vary from person to person. There's realistically no way of knowing all of these reasons for a person. So when we come to the three options, the first option that I said is to continue the pregnancy to term and parenting. So when we talk about parenting, when we talk about parenting, so some people may decide that they are in fact able to continue their pregnancy despite an unintended pregnancy. So despite the pregnancy being unintentional, it becomes a wanted pregnancy, because at that point they reassess everything. They reassess the support that they have. They reassess their financial situation. They reassess the way they visualize their life. And at the end of it, they may decide that they are able to continue their pregnancy. And so they opt to continue it, and they choose to be parents in the future. I'm so sorry. Some people may choose to be parents alone, while some people may choose to be parents along with their partner. When parenting together with a partner, irrespective of whether or not the couple chooses to get married or just live together, or even have to live apart, the commitment to raise a child together as a couple is a very important discussion. So if someone is deciding to, raise a child together as a couple, it's really important to talk to each other about the changes that can be expected to the relationship, to the income of the person, to the lifestyle that, raising a child would bring. And also realize that it's normal to, feel this whole range of emotions related to parenting and to be worried about how you would cope. But if you have made the decision that you would want to continue the pregnancy, that is perfectly fine as well. if it is someone who you have just met, it's not someone you have a history of making decisions with in the past, or if the relationship isn't the most stable, this decision of continuing the pregnancy can be a tricky decision. It can make the journey very difficult. It can be you can come across hurdles that you may never expect, but that doesn't invalidate the decision in any way. When considering to continue the pregnancy with a partner, some questions to consider may include if you are financially or emotionally ready for a child, if they're okay with the thought of a long-term committed relationship, would they stay together even if there wasn't a pregnancy, and how would that affect their situation? And finally, if they are prepared to kind of raise the child alone, even if things don't work out with their partner. Because if that doesn't happen, they would still have a child to raise in that situation. That doesn't mean that just because a person is parenting alone, that makes that situation any less different from, like any less important or anything. So it's entirely possible and normal to even raise a child alone. Sorry, I meant raise a child alone over here, not together, even if the relationship doesn't continue. So it's perfectly fine to do that. And parenting alone can also be a choice for some people. Some people may find themselves parenting alone. They may not have intended for that to happen. But parenting alone is also an equally valid choice. Irrespective, ultimately, the point to keep in mind is that if someone is considering to continue the pregnancy, then there are things that people can do to ensure a healthy pregnancy. This is really important because sometimes when we face an unintended pregnancy, people can take some time to process, to kind of realize what they plan to do, or to come to a decision. Some people come to it super quickly, which is great. Some people don't. Irrespective, whenever the decision is made to continue a pregnancy, to ensure that the pregnancy is safe, it's important to immediately see a doctor, then set up appointments with an OBGYN, etc., just to kind of make sure that the pregnancy ends up being healthy and safe, and that there's no unforeseen harm in the future related to the pregnancy. The second option that we face, or that a person can choose, is adoption. So when we talk about adoption, adoption simply means, okay, wait, before I go into that, just again, another kind of, refresher on what the language of this is. A lot of times we hear people say terms like give up a child for adoption, or give away a child for adoption, or to surrender a child. And surrender is actually a term that is used in our in our adoption law as well in our country. So these are all terms that people use very often when describing adoption, like to put up a child for adoption, or to give up the child, or to get rid of the child. And all of these are terms that are super judgmental. So just to be a little bit nicer again, and to be, just be basic, decent human beings, the term that we would try to use instead of this is terms like placed for adoption, to choose adoption, to make an adoption plan instead of something else. And all of this is super important to just, I know I sound really picky about language, but it can mean the world of a difference to a person if you actually avoid using these judgmental terms. And the reason is that terms like choosing adoption, making adoption, these are non-judgmental terms, and they imply that the pregnant person would make well-informed decisions about their own body ultimately, and about their own future life. So rather than putting any sort of blame and, like putting any sort of weird connotations, we'll just stick to these slightly better terms. That said, what is adoption? Adoption is simply the legal process of placing the child with people who will raise the child as their own. So adoption is a permanent decision, and all the legal rights and responsibilities are transferred from the person who gives birth to the child to the adoptive parents. So if you see over here again, there's something that I did with the language where I don't want to call it birth parents, because I feel that If that person chooses to identify as a parent, that's great. But otherwise, again, calling the person a birth parent when they may not intend to be a parent, again, is putting a lot of emotional guilt on them. And also adoptive parents in brackets, because I don't feel the need to call parents adoptive parents, separately. They're just parents. So these are again tricky small things about the language that we use, which is something that is super important. So it's the legal process essentially of placing the child with the people who will raise the child as their own. So it's from the person who gave birth to the child to the parents of the child. So a pregnant person may choose adoption for, again, a whole variety of reasons. These are the same things that we discussed, the financial situation of their own, the time commitment that they have, their support, their relationship, the way they visualize their own future. The same reasons that we discussed for pregnancy being unintended, same reasons why a person may choose adoption as one of their options. So if a pregnant person chooses adoption, there is someone else out there who is hoping to adopt and build their family through adoption. So it is possible that if a person chooses to, place the child in the adoption system, they will get adopted and they will have, a great life with parents. The decision to place the child for adoption, though, is an incredibly personal one, and the pregnant person is the only person who can make that decision. They are themselves in charge of their choice. So no one else can really be involved in coercing this person into deciding what they want to do. Legal situations may differ, but strictly speaking, from a human rights perspective, the decision of whatever one wishes to do when faced with an unintended pregnancy is simply their own choice. There are, of course, laws that guide adoptive families and protect the rights of the pregnant person as well. So for that, if the person has made a decision has chosen adoption, then it's important to get in touch with adoption agencies and to educate themselves about the law, so that people know what the process is ahead and so that things go smoothly. There are many different reasons why people may, be considering adoption as an option. People consider things like family, relationships, money, school, work, so many different things. And most people consider all of it. But like I've been saying, every person's situation is incredibly different. And again, they are the only person who can decide for themselves what is the best situation for them, right? There's no one else who can really decide it for them. So when a pregnant person is considering adoption as an option, there are some questions that they can ask themselves, similar to what the person asked themselves when they were considering continuing the pregnancy and parenting. So when considering adoption, questions that people can consider are things like, am I ready to go through pregnancy and childbirth? Because pregnancy and childbirth can both be very physically, mentally, emotionally taxing. Am I comfortable with the idea of adoption? So is that something that I would be okay with if I choose adoption? Do I believe that the child who will be born will be treated well by their parents? Because some people, if they're not convinced in the system of their own countries, they may struggle with choosing adoption as an option. Do I feel that I cannot care for a child now? As in, would you consider abortion or parenting instead of adoption? Or do you feel that you could care for a child now and then choose parenting, Is anyone else pressuring me to choose adoption as an option? Am I prepared to cope with the emotions that I may have after an adoption? And do I have people in my life who will support me through whichever decision you make, whether it's the pregnancy, birth, and adoption process that would come ahead? These are all important things to consider when thinking about adoption as well. And these are just few things, people can have a huge variety of reasons apart from this as well. But these are just few things to kind of have solid answers to. And one of the most important that I see is someone pressuring me to choose adoption point. Because irrespective of which option it is, whether it's adoption, continuing a pregnancy, or abortion, none of it is okay if it is being forced onto someone, if it is being coerced for someone to do it, unless it's the best decision for that person. No one can really pressure the person into doing that. What is the law regarding adoption in our country? So the act that governs adoptions in India is the Juvenile Justice, Care and Protection of Children Act of 2015. We have an agency called Central Adoption Resource Authority, which is the main agency that monitors and regulates all of the country related adoption. So whether this is residents of India adopting children, or whether it is international, like non-resident Indians adopting children from India. And it's also, of course, part of the Ministry of Women and Childcare. So when a person chooses adoption, so you remember on the first slide under adoption, how I said that a lot of people use the term surrendered a child, which is not the best. Unfortunately, our law does that as well. We can't really change much about it, unfortunately. So in the next few slides, I will be quoting the law. So I will say surrendered child, but I hope you understand that, of course, that is not the appropriate term to use, and better terms to use are, the child who's placed for adoption, or to not use terms like surrenderer when talking about a person who's chosen adoption when faced with an unintended pregnancy. So these are not very nice terms, but I will be quoting the law for the next few slides. So that's why I'm using these terms. But so when a person chooses an adoption, the law declares that the child will now be called a surrendered child, and the person would officially end up renouncing any sort of control, whether it's legal or like other control over the child, when the whole adoption process is complete. And yes, it can be a bit of a time-consuming process. The first thing that needs to be done is that there is such a thing known as the Child Welfare Committee. The pregnant person who wishes to surrender their child under this act, it can apply to the Child Welfare Committee. So they let the committee know that they wish to, surrender their child, and then the committee is like, okay, fine. For people who for any reason are not able to give an application, if they're not able to read or write, for example, or for any other reason, if they're not able to give an application, then the Child Welfare Committee helps out by their own legal aid counsel, helping them through the whole process of drafting the application. One very important document that exists is a deed of surrender, which is literally a deed which says that the child is officially being surrendered, and that the surrenderer, or how I would call it, is the pregnant person who is, choosing adoption, will be officially renouncing custody of the child. So that is what the deed says. Now, the deed is an official document, of course, and there are various procedures for, who needs to sign the deed, who the witnesses are, and stuff like that. Some of these are a bit problematic. For example, it states that if it's an unmarried person, then the witness needs to be a family member who is also a female, who needs to be there when the person is kind of, attending, when the person is signing, to witness it. And it's kind of weird because it takes away from the whole privacy of it. If a person, if an unmarried woman wants to just choose adoption without anyone else knowing, because it would mean that this would definitively involve a family member. It also means that, there need to be so many other people involved in the decision making about the choice of the pregnancy. But ultimately, shouldn't it just depend on the pregnant person themselves? And these are things that, the law kind of gets wrong. Another thing, of course, is related to what I had said right at the start, where it only recognizes women as people who can get pregnant. And this is not true. Trans people can get pregnant too. Gender non-binary people can get pregnant too. And the language of the law is so gendered that there's no space for, options for these people. And that's really not that great. So there's a whole variety of situations. There's the whole thing about if there are two parents involved, then both of them need to sign, and that whole process, which some good things, some slightly problematic things. And who needs to be present, who needs to be witness, who needs to be signing, depends on the situation of the parent, again in quotations, because like I said, it's just the person who gave birth, but maybe not the parent. Then there is a specialized adoption agency that comes in and the child welfare committee, which together ensure that this copy of the deed is given to the surrendering person. So the surrendering person is given this deed, and all of the details about the child are entered online. So online there is a system called the Child Adoption Resource Information and Guidance System, which is made by the specialized adoption agency, and all of the details that are there about the child are put online. A little bit later, not this early in the timeline, but a little bit later, what is done is that the child's study report as well as a medical examination report about the child, so the child will undergo a complete medical examination and everything, and that entire report will also be added. So essentially it's kind of a database for prospective parents and for all of the information about children placed for adoption is available over there. Once the deed is signed and the deed is official, the surrendering person is still given a period of 60 days or 2 months to consider or reconsider if they are if they would wish to reclaim their child, the child. This is kind of just a 2-month leeway period in case their decision changes, which brings me to another slightly problematic issue about the law that yes, I mean, it would be great if everyone wanted to continue their pregnancy and become parents, but it's equally valid if someone wants to choose adoption. And multiple times in the law, there are places where the surrendering person is made to question, is made to consider. Legally, it says that they have to be counseled about the benefits of continuing the pregnancy and, you know, being a parent rather than choosing adoption and stuff like that. And frankly, after a person has made their decision about which of the three options they choose, whether it is parenting or adoption or abortion, when legal bodies and positions of power literally kind of interfere and keep coming back and, you know, asking and forcing people to reconsider their decisions, it's nothing but undermining their decision to make that decision, like undermining their authority to make that decision about their own bodies. And again, not the best thing to do, but our law does says that. And so there is this 2 months period where the person is allowed, if they wish to reclaim the child. If after 2 months the child is not reclaimed, the committee officially puts out an order that says that the child is now legally free. So once the child is legally free, then it means that they can now be adopted. So this is actually when they actually do the whole medical examination and everything, and then that information goes on the database. And as soon as the child is declared legally free for adoption, this child is allowed to be given an adoption. Again, what the law says, but what I would say would rather be placed in adoption. This is kind of what the whole process is like. As per the law, I mean, I haven't highlighted a lot about the whole process with adoption from the purpose of a person wanting to become an adoptive parent. So what are the, you know, rules that govern them? Because right now we're talking more about the perspective from a pregnant person who may choose adoption and not from the perspective of someone wanting to adopt a child. But of course, there's a lot more to this law. And if you go onto the website of CARA, which I told you about at the start, is the organization that kind of coordinates everything. It's pretty great. It has a lot of information about all of the other rules and laws as well. And it's a pretty wholesome explanation of how the adoption process actually works. And depending upon the situation of the child, the age of the child, it's possible to, you know, after the whole process from the parent side is also initiated, for adoption to occur quickly within like a pretty soon period after the child is declared legally free. So it's a pretty smooth system that we have. Of course, there are flaws in the actual enactment of it. There are a few flaws that I came across when I was researching the law. So, I mean, it can do better, but it's doing pretty well for now. And ultimately, adoption is an incredibly valid option, you know. So it's really important that due regard be given to the privacy of the surrendering person and the surrendered child, and the law recognizes it. So no information, no advertisement will be put out in case of a child being surrendered or becoming legally free for adoption. no notice, there's going to be no public notice about it. It only goes on that website which has all the databases, and strict confidentiality has to be maintained about the surrendering person. The law says that none of their information can be divulged for any reason unless the surrendering person consents to it and says that they themselves would like their information to be, released. Because sometimes people wish to kind of still be in contact with the adoptive family afterwards and stuff like that. So the law thankfully recognizes the need for confidentiality and privacy with this whole process, and that is again a great thing about the law. Now to discuss the third option, which is abortion, Zainab will come in and talk about it.
Hello everyone, I'm Zainab Engineer, and I will be talking to you about abortion, which is another option which is available to anybody who has had an unintended pregnancy. Um, just to start off the session in a way, I am going to give you all one number. 1 in 4 pregnancies end in induced abortion. Now, it's something to think about, right? If there's 100 people who get pregnant, 1 in 4 of those 25% of those pregnancies are going to be aborted. So it kind of goes to show how many unintended pregnancies are happening. We have to kind of keep in mind that sex is had for pleasure more often than it is for reproductive purposes. And it kind of only makes sense that with the kind of sex education that we're given and the kind of lack of awareness that we have regarding contraception and safe practices when it comes to sex, a lot of people do end up having an unintended pregnancy. And obviously, we've discussed 2 of those options. One was continuing the pregnancy, another was surrendering the child for placing the child up for adoption. But one option which a lot of people do choose and go for is abortion. Now, 56 million abortions took place worldwide between the years 2010 and 2014. Now, these are both statistics which I have picked up from the WHO site. So it's pretty reliable, okay? It's definitely not exaggerated over here. But if the number is so big, it makes us think, right? Why are we not talking about abortion more? A lot of us have not really thought more about abortion. It doesn't come up in casual conversation. It doesn't come up in our formal education a lot. We taught about the MTP Act a bit in FMT, in second year, but how much do we actually understand when it comes to, the details and what goes on in a person's mind when they're actually choosing abortion, right? So, yeah. So, is abortion legal in India? Yes, it is. So, when the government somewhere in the 1960s and 70s, they realized that the maternal mortality was really high, and one of the main reasons for it was unsafe abortions. People were going to quacks and they were trying to get their unintended pregnancies terminated because they didn't want to continue it. And those quacks were definitely not doing it the right way, and a lot of women ended up with serious complications, and a lot even died. And it contributed a lot to the high maternal mortality of India at that time. So the Shantilal committee sat down and they decided that yes, we definitely need to have a law, and we need to increase the access for safe abortion so that people can come into a government hospital and visit a doctor and actually get it done the right way. So abortion was criminalized under the section 312 of the IPC. Anybody who intentionally caused a miscarriage is penalized under the section 312. But then they introduced the Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act in 1971. According to this, under certain circumstances, the doctor is exempted from any kind of persecution under the section 312. So only under specific clauses, which we will talk about in a minute, the Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act gave a person immunity. So, and this was basically introduced because there was a lot of maternal mortality, as I said. There was a lot of effect on the economy of India at that time, and all of these things were they wanted to hopefully target those issues, right? So what is the Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act? Um, according to the act, according to the MTP Act, a person can get their um, unwanted pregnancy aborted by until 20 weeks of gestation. Okay, so if your pregnancy is under 12 weeks, the gestational age is less than 12 weeks, then you need the signature, the opinion of only one registered medical practitioner. Okay, and if the gestational age is between 12 to 20 weeks, then you would require the opinion of two RMPs, two registered medical practitioners. Anything more than 20 weeks would then have to be contested in the court, and a lot of people have gone because there's lots of issues with the 20-week limit. A lot of you all might know the anomaly scan which happens, the USG scan for anomalies takes place between 18 to 22 weeks approximately. So anybody who has detected some kind of anomaly in the fetus is going to want to and chooses to abort that pregnancy may be stuck because of this 20-week limit. Because as you can see, you need two opinions of RMPs in a place where doctors may not be accessible. Remote areas, a lot of OBGYNs are not available. In all of those areas, it would be difficult to get two signatures. And what if you went for your anomaly scan at 20 weeks? What then? So those people would end up getting stuck with that pregnancy, and either they would have to go to the court and contest it, which is again a different kind of hassle, a very different kind of trauma, and nobody really wants to go through that. So in March 2020, the Rajya Sabha passed a bill, the MTP Bill 2020, in which they increased the limit to 24 weeks. Okay, even after 24 weeks, they have put in the additional clause that even after 24 weeks, in case of a severe fetal anomaly, you can get permission from a medical board in that case, not just an RMP, a medical board, and then get that pregnancy terminated. They've also made another change. They've increased the period of requiring one RMP signature to 20 weeks, and 20 to 24 weeks then requires two signatures. So that's about the amendment. But who really can get an abortion? So anybody who is a seeker above the age, seeker of abortion, okay? A seeker of abortion above the age of 18 years can walk into a hospital, visit a registered medical practitioner and ask for an abortion if they fall under the following four clauses. Now, I'm going to give you all two disclaimers over here. I say the word seeker over here, abortion seeker, but the law says woman or pregnant woman. Now, the problem with that is that as we spoke about gender, on day one, we realize that it's not just women who get pregnant and women who are people with uteruses, right? So a seeker could be any person who is gender non-binary, who may be trans, and when the act says that it's a pregnant woman can seek an abortion, it kind of excludes those people and it becomes difficult. So the law does say woman. I am just saying seeker because we're trying to be inclusive with our language, as Shweta also spoke about during her part. We want to create a language that is inclusive and doesn't exclude people and create discrimination on our side. So any seeker above the age of 18 years. What if you're less than 18 years? Then you would need a guardian to sign, okay, for the consent. Even if it's a person with a mental illness and does not have the right to consent, as we've learned, even they would need a guardian to consent for the abortion. So if you have a medical reason, like the physical or mental health is endangered by the pregnancy, or a eugenic reason where there is a risk of the fetus being born with a congenital anomaly, or humanitarian cases when a seeker is a survivor of rape, and social when the pregnancy is a result of contraceptive failure. But this clause applies only for married women. And obviously, because of this clause, a lot of unmarried women who ended up having an unintended pregnancy, as you can understand, it's a lot of unmarried women, if they do get pregnant, that pregnancy would be unwanted for them. I'm not saying all, but a lot of them. And that substantial chunk of women was being left out and was not being given access to safe abortion. So again, the amendment which was passed in March 2020, so that bill has not yet been passed by the Lok Sabha. It's only been passed by the Rajya Sabha. So it's still in the parliament, but it's very close to becoming an act. But according to the new bill, they have changed this clause, including the married women, and they've written woman and her partner. So that could also potentially include anybody who's not married but is in a relationship. So medical, eugenic, humanitarian, and social. If you fall under any of those four clauses, then you could go to, and you are above 18 years of age or have a guardian who is consenting on your behalf, then you can go and get an abortion. Um, who would you go to for an abortion? You would have to go to a person who, a registered medical practitioner who is who has a recognized qualification under the Indian Medical Council Act, who is in the state medical register and has the following experience. So either they've assisted an RMP, that is registered medical practitioner, in 25 cases of abortion, or they have a postgraduate qualification in OBGYN, or they have a 6 month housemanship in OBGYN. So all of these people can have been given the power to provide an abortion according to the MTP Act 1971. But now that we've spoken so much about the law, we've understood that it's legal. Abortion is legal in India if you come under those four clauses, and most people do. And the new amendment which is coming in is trying to include as many people as possible. There are still more asks that we do have, like including, gender inclusive language, and talking about, say, instead of taking a very eugenic stand, like saying, just about all pregnancies with fetal anomalies, we would like to shift to a more women's rights based approach, where if the woman chooses, she can opt for an abortion, that sort of language. But yes, if you want to know more about this, you can visit our page on Instagram or Facebook, I Say Advocates. So what exactly is an abortion? I've been talking about abortion for so long. What is an abortion? It is the termination of pregnancy caused by the removal or expulsion of the products of conception from the uterus. So the products of conception are removed from the uterus, and that can be done either spontaneously or can be induced. Spontaneous abortion is what we normally call miscarriage, and that is a natural phenomenon and something that we will learn about in OBGYN. When we talk about induced abortions are the ones which come under the MTP Act. That is the abortions that a person with an unwanted pregnancy would opt for, right? So there are two ways of getting an abortion. One is a medical and one is a surgical method, right? So medical abortion would require you to take a pill, not a pill, but pills, and you would have the abortion. And in surgical, you would have to go to the hospital and get a procedure done. I'll talk more about it in a bit. So this is definitely not abortion, right? So when we talk about how abortions are happening, how they're conducted, this is something that, pictures like this come up. They're put out by people who are anti-choice, and who are trying to deter people from having an abortion. But you will see in a minute why this is so wrong. First of all, majority of the abortions that are elective occur in the first trimester itself. So you would not have a full-term fetus like this. More often than not, what is expelled is a bunch of cells, and it's not so developed. The organogenesis isn't so what is it called? Isn't so well developed, and you definitely don't use scissors or anything, and it doesn't go through the abdomen. I'll tell you all more about it, but what I wanted to tell you all is that this image is something that is very commonly seen when it comes to propaganda, but this is definitely incorrect. It's not accurate. Okay, and I'll tell you why. So first we'll talk about medical methods of abortion. So there is a combination regimen and there is a misoprostol only regimen. So there are two drugs which are used here. First is mifepristone, which is a progesterone antagonist. As you know, progesterone is the pregnancy hormone. So when I give an antagonist to progesterone, it will stop the progesterone from supporting the pregnancy further, right? And misoprostol is a prostaglandin analog. As you know, prostaglandins will lead to softening of the will lead to cervical dilatation and induce contractions in the uterus, so that whatever products of conception are present inside the uterus will get expelled, right? The just to repeat, mifepristone is a progesterone antagonist, and misoprostol is a prostaglandin analog, right? So in the combination regimen, you would have to take one mifepristone tablet and four or more misoprostol tablets. And in the misoprostol only regimen, you just have to take the misoprostol tablets. Um, Together, they have an efficacy rate of more than 95%, right? So how would you have a medical abortion? You would go to the registered medical practitioner. They will do a basic checkup for you. They'll confirm the pregnancy either via UPT or else via USG. They will ask you about your last menstrual period, and uh, they'll try to basically date your gestation, and whatever is the gestational age, based on that you will be given a certain regimen. As you can see, it differs slightly for less than 12 weeks and more than 12 weeks. If it's less than 12 weeks, you have to take a 200 milligram oral tablet of mifepristone, and you have to take 4 tablets of misoprostol, either orally or vaginally or sublingually. If it's just a misoprostol um, regimen, then you would just be taking the misoprostol as well. If it's more than 12 weeks, then your mifepristone remains the same, but the misoprostol becomes 400 microgram tablets taken every 3 hours, depending on how much your gestational age is. Now, medical methods of abortion are, um, if you go to if I want to simplify it a little bit, I would say that they induce a sort of a situation that's very similar to the way a woman gets a period, right? So there's abdominal cramps. The misoprostol is causing the uterus to contract. There's abdominal cramps, and the mifepristone has now led the uterine lining to shed, so there's some bleeding. All of this can lead to some pelvic pain, fatigue, nausea, and vomiting, and some low-grade fever because of the misoprostol. So, uh, one thing that I'd like to say is, if you see all of these words that are on your screen right now, all of these are most of these are things that women experience during their monthly menstruation period anyway. So essentially speaking, when you do have a medical abortion, the effects that you have are very similar to that. It's as simple as going to a doctor. The doctor prescribes a tablet to you, and you go home, and it's basically like you have a period. You wear your pad, and whatever content comes out is then expelled. So this is 95% effective. And what I want to say is that because of its safety, right, this can also be used by women as a way to self-manage abortion. When I say self-managed, it doesn't mean that they're just sitting at home and themselves taking this tablet. It means that they have to first of all have the means of getting complete information, right? And they need to know what are the normal and abnormal effects of going through a medical abortion, right? So what is on your screen right now is all normal abortion. And if there's anything more than this, the woman should know and should then get back to her doctor and talk to them, what needs to be done next. But if you think about it, this is definitely not surgical, so the chances of infection or sepsis and hemorrhage are really less, because there's no invasion as such, and you're stimulating you're using hormones only in a way, so it doesn't really there is no trauma. If I say there's no trauma induced on the body. So this is really safe. In fact, the WHO even says that nurses and Ayush doctors can be, you know, trained in providing medical abortion, because a lot of remote areas where OBGYNs are not available, it's very difficult for a woman to travel a very long distance to come for an abortion. And maybe it would be easier if the local, Ayush doctors or nurses would know how to do this. Plus, there's no skill involved in this. So yeah, these are the advantages of having a medical abortion. Um, Coming to surgical methods of abortion, you can use a manual vacuum aspiration. I'll explain all of these in some brief details in the next slide. So manual vacuum aspiration is done up to 12 weeks, dilatation and curettage up to 14 weeks, dilatation and evacuation up to 26 weeks. Now I know the law says that we can only have an abortion until 20 weeks, but this method, dilatation and evacuation, until 26 weeks, why it's written over here is because there's other countries which do have laws which are more liberal than India's, and they do allow. In fact, Canada allows on-demand abortion, so you don't need to fall under any clause right up to 9 months, like right up to term. So you can walk in at any time into a clinic and ask for an abortion, and they have to give you one because that is your right over there in Canada. So yes, dilatation and evacuation can then be used in those cases. Also, just as an interesting side note, um, the number of maternal the statistics when it comes to comparing countries having more liberal abortion laws as compared to less liberal laws. Canada does have a very small number of maternal mortality which is attributed to unsafe abortion. So it just kind of goes to show that the more the law supports the rights of women, the more it actually helps in preventing any kind of unnecessary deaths. As I said, medical abortion is 95% effective, and surgical methods are 99% effective. So 99 is a pretty good number, I think. And yes, moving on to talking about manual vacuum aspiration now. Um, so this is what the syringe looks like. This is known as the MVA syringe, manual vacuum aspiration syringe. So if you can see the syringe on the top left, okay, I want you to kind of imagine, the blood collection procedure that we normally do in the wards. This is exactly that. Okay, this is just a syringe which is a little bit bigger in size because you're removing more tissue. So this is a bigger syringe, and you can see there's a plunger on one end and there's the barrel over here. So you just pull on there's a valve also in the beginning. So if you shut the valve and then you pull on the plunger, it creates a negative pressure in the barrel, right? And then you see the picture below it, those are the cannulae. These cannulae are inserted into the cervix, into the uterus through the cervix, which you can see in the third picture, right? So what's gone inside is the cannula. So you will give the person misoprostol and use cervical dilators to dilate the cervix before the procedure starts. Okay. Then you insert the cannula and attach the syringe which has negative pressure in it. When you release the valve, the negative pressure inside the barrel of the syringe will then suck out the material that's inside the uterus through the cannula, right? And if you go to think about it, the cannulae are made of rubber, plastic, and they're pretty flexible. They have a rounded, blunt tip, so the chances of perforating the uterus, causing any kind of trauma, is very, very low. The chances of creating some kind, because this is a very simple, it's sort of like an OPD procedure actually. The person doesn't need to get admitted to the hospital for this. They can get the procedure done and leave after a few hours. So this procedure is that simple. It can be used up to 12 weeks. And in India, they use it for a lesser period of time, but the WHO does give a larger sort of time frame for it. But that's okay. We're moving ahead with the time slowly, but we are. And this is a very effective method. There's a 99% efficacy. Now, one of the biggest advantages of the MVA syringe is that it does not need electricity. It does not need electricity. It does not need a lot of skill training. So according to the WHO, you can teach this skill to Ayush doctors and nurses, so that more number of healthcare providers can then start providing these sort of procedures to women who especially don't have access to a OBGYN in their locality. So this is about the MVA. When I talk about the dilatation and curettage, it's similar where you dilate the cervix and then you use a curette, which is a sort of scoop like, it's sort of like a scoop like instrument where you just scrape out the contents of the uterus through the cervix. As you can kind of imagine, this is a little bit traumatic. Obviously, in the hands of a skilled practitioner, it would not be traumatic. They know how much pressure to apply and they know how deep to go. But when it comes to the same procedure, D&C, dilatation and curettage, being done by a quack, by a person who has not been trained formally in this procedure, it can lead to a lot of complications, because the curette can then go and perforate into the uterus, or it can introduce infections inside the uterus if it has not been sterilized properly. So that's just one of the drawbacks. But this drawback applies when a person does not follow the correct technique and the correct asepsis that is supposed to be maintained during the procedure. Finally, the dilatation and evacuation is very similar to MVA, but instead of using a syringe, they use an actual electronic machine which does the suctioning. So the cannula goes in, but it is then attached to a machine which suctions out the tissue um, with a proper power source. So it just has more, you don't have to keep removing the syringe and emptying out the contents. You can just remove everything in a jar in one go. So this is about the surgical abortion. Um, this is also a very safe procedure. 99% efficacy is there, and especially with a skill provider, you can reduce the number of the complications that may occur drastically. In fact, very interestingly, uh, safe abortion is actually 10 times safer than childbirth. I'll repeat. Safe abortion is 10 times safer than childbirth. It's even safer than an appendectomy. It's safer than removing your wisdom tooth out. So basic procedures that people undergo on quite a regular basis in hospitals, surgical and medical abortions are safer than those. So, the kind of picture that I showed you initially with the big scissor and, the full term fetus and all, those are very rare. Full term fetus, very, very rare, first of all. And the scissor is definitely not used. You saw the whole procedure right now. There was no scissor anywhere. Okay. So, it just goes to show that there's a lot of misinformation, a lot of myths that are ingrained within us because of the media and exposure that we get regarding these kind of topics. Now, this is definitely not where abortion ends. Okay, there's something known as comprehensive abortion care. When a person comes in for an abortion, right? This pregnant person has had an unwanted pregnancy, and there's a very good chance that they may be doing this alone. They may be doing this under a lot of emotions. There's a lot of mental sort of stress that is going on in your mind when it comes to um, you know um, taking decisions in your life that can be such. Now, I'm not saying everybody who has an abortion regrets it or something like that, that they're selfish. Definitely not. A person who chooses to get an abortion is doing that because it is their body, it is their choice to do what they want to do. But it's still because of the stigma that a person faces in life in general, the kind of lack of support that people have when it comes to accessing abortion, the fact that a person may not even have their own partner supporting them during this. All of this kind of requires us as medical practitioners to provide the best care that we can. And that is part of the comprehensive abortion care. Um, the first thing that is part of comprehensive abortion care is choice. A woman should, I'm saying woman over here, but we should be saying person, sorry. A person who is seeking an abortion must ideally be given the choice to choose that abortion or not choose that abortion. That is what choice means. That they choose for themselves. It's not their partner or their family or their culture or their friends or anybody around them really who is trying to pressure them into or against an abortion. Whether they choose an abortion for an unwanted pregnancy or they don't is supposed to be their choice because it is their body. Okay. And this choice is really important. It's very easy to say that a doctor should counsel a woman when she comes in for an abortion, ask her why she needs that abortion. But it's important to remember that counseling only goes so far, and support really goes even further for them. A person may be requiring a lot of support from you in that moment, and supporting their choice is something, especially if it's a person who is so what I mean to say is that if they don't have the kind of uh, support from their friends or their partner, it's really difficult for them to do something like this alone, coming to a hospital and consulting a doctor. A lot of us at this age too may not have visited a doctor alone by ourselves. We like when someone comes along with us. So yes, having somebody supporting you through it is really important. Consent is second. It's important to remember that according to the law, only the woman or the seeker who is seeking that abortion needs to consent for that procedure. The partner does not need to consent. There are instances where seekers have been asked to get signatures from their partners just to avoid some kind of complications later, some controversies later, but it is not required by the law. A doctor is bound to provide the abortion if the person is over 18 years of age with solely the seeker's consent. Confidentiality and privacy. So, this is something that even the MTP law addresses. According to the MTP law 1971, confidentiality, breach of confidentiality can result in you getting fined. But according to the amendment, they've made that clause even more stringent. If you breach the confidentiality of a person who has sought an abortion from you, then you can be fined, but even jailed. So even prison time has been added to breach of confidentiality now. And privacy is really important. In fact, it's important for any medical procedure, but more so for procedures that may be stigmatized in society. So it's important that you don't create more hurdles and barriers for your patients. So next is non-judgmental provision. A lot of doctors will deny giving an abortion if it doesn't align with their morals. Now there is a lot of debate going on around that, but it's important to remember that, as I said initially also, that counseling only goes so far. A person who wants an abortion is going to get one regardless of whether you give it to them or not, because they are especially if it's a person who really needs that abortion and is really stuck between a rock and a hard place, then they're going to get that abortion regardless of whether you give it. So if you don't, they're probably going to go to another doctor, and worse, if they end up at a quack's place, then there is a very good chance that they may get an unsafe abortion. And we'll talk more about what an unsafe abortion is in a bit. So it's very important that as as a medical practitioner, you aren't sitting over there and passing judgment. Whether it is an unmarried woman who's come with an unwanted pregnancy, whether it is a married woman who's come for an abortion, lots of different kinds of stigmas affect people in different kind of scenarios. And it's important that we are not the ones who are creating barriers for a person. Like the Hippocratic Oath says, do no harm. Our judgment can actually deter a person from seeking a safe abortion and push them instead to get an unsafe abortion. And we definitely don't want to do harm. We've kind of figured out why. It's not our job to do that. So, yes, being empathetic, being sensitive is something that becomes part of your non-judgmental provision of abortion services. So yes, being empathetic, being sensitive would only make that person more comfortable, and they're more likely to open up to you, and hopefully they can go back with a better sense of um, the fact that they had to go through a procedure, but they're not alone in that, and you were there and you took care of them and they were comfortable throughout it. So yeah, this is all part of the comprehensive abortion care, and this is what the whole procedure that I have spoken about until now, comprehensive abortion care, that is safe abortion. What is it? It is an abortion is safe when it is performed by a trained provider under aseptic conditions with the right tools for gestational age. So it is safe if you have a trained provider, you have hygienic aseptic conditions, and you have the correct tools for it. You need these three things for an abortion to be safe. And these safe abortions will not usually lead to any long-term negative health effects, right? As I told you, it has a very good efficacy rate, and in fact, they're safer than a lot of other medical procedures that we do in our practices anyway. So, this is safe abortion when I talk about it, right? Um, yes, but it is not. When I told you that there were so many people, there's such a high rate of maternal mortality caused due to unsafe abortion. Why is it that when I told you that there is a law which specifically provides access to abortion, and when you have a whole medical system where the procedures can be as simple as taking medicines for it, why do people still choose unsafe abortions then? If it's so simple, then they should be going for it, right? So there are something known as barriers, hurdles, something that prevents a person's access to safe abortion. These barriers can be of a lot of different types. We'll discuss these in more detail. So the first one we'll talk about is medical. We've all learned about this in community medicine. Um, the remote rural areas in our country do not have doctors at times, let alone access to OBGYN. There may not be a medical officer over there at times. So access is a very, very, very big issue. There, in the locality that you live, there is a good possibility that you may not have access to a doctor who can give you safe abortion, and that would then need you to go to an unsafe provider. So that's definitely there. Another medical barrier that comes in is the bias from healthcare providers themselves. Um, Healthcare professionals does not just include doctors, even includes nurses or the support staff that's there in the hospital. All of these people, if there is a lot of stigma and a lot of discrimination against people who come to um, access abortion in a hospital or in a clinic, and if the person who's seeking the abortion gets discriminated against or scolded, then there's a very good chance that they will turn around and walk away. So these kind of barriers are created by the medical system themselves, right? Another barrier that a person faces is a financial barrier. So I'd like to elaborate over here. Medical abortion costs 500 rupees. um, then surgical abortion in the government setup will cost around 1,000 to 5,000 rupees, and abortions in the private setup can range even up to 20,000 rupees. And to all of this would also be added the doctor's consultation fee, and charges for your pregnancy confirmation test and a USG, and all of those things that are required around it. So a lot of money may not be required if you come at a early enough stage and you can only require a medical abortion at that stage. Then it's something can get over within 500 to 1,000 rupees. But to think about it, even that 500 or 1,000 rupees may not be easy for a person to part with, at times. And if you think about it, women in our country are very dependent on their families for money. So if they are trying to get an abortion without informing their families, then it's going to be very difficult for them to do this secretively, because there is no money in their hands, and they have to account for every penny that they spend. So finances is one big barrier. Another thing, if it's a young person or an unmarried person, there's a very good chance that they may not be earning, right? And if they're not earning and they have landed up with an unwanted pregnancy, they may want to go to a doctor. They may even know the law. If we look at good sort of a good scenario where they know about the law, they know that they fall under one of the clauses, and they can access safe abortion, they may still not be able to gather the amount of finances required for it. Then socio-cultural barriers are another barrier. The first one is definitely stigma. There is a lot of negative publicity that abortion gets. People talk about it in very negative undertones. A lot of conversation you may have seen on the social media too right now. Um, Another barrier is religion. So what kind of culture you belong to, what kind of religion you belong to, may also have certain kinds of stands against abortion, and this can also lead to a person not being able to access abortion openly, right? age is definitely one factor. If you aren't above 18 years of age, then you would require a guardian to come and sign for you. That would mean that you have to tell your parents about it, and yes, that can complicate the situation for people, especially if they're unmarried. Sorry for that. Especially if they're unmarried and they want to keep that relationship away from the family and all of those kind of things. Even marriage, at times it's difficult to get an abortion if the person is married, because there's this thing that you know you need to reproduce when you're in a marriage, and you may want to space your children, you may want to limit your family in that at that time, and maybe that is why you want to get an abortion. But even then, that unwanted pregnancy is very difficult to abort, even though you directly have a clause saying contraceptive failure for married couples directly makes you a candidate for abortion. um, anyway, legal barriers are another barrier that people face. Obviously, I told you about the law, and the law in India is fairly liberal only when compared to the countries around us. But if we try to compare ourselves to a country like Canada, where abortions are given on demand until full term, then ours is pretty restrictive, right? Because we restrict it at some age, we restricted it for some people, and it's definite, and the law is definitely not inclusive for everyone. A person who may be trans, who may be gender non-binary, queer, may not be able to say that yes, I am a woman and I need um, an abortion, legally speaking. So all of these people get excluded by the MPP Act. So even though we do have a law, there are still a lot of drawbacks to it. There's a lot of loopholes to it, and it's important that we kind of work on it. And so just to add in over here, the law was passed in 1971, right? 1971 was 49 years ago. That means that the medical system was different back then. The society was different back then. The socio-cultural scenario in that time was different. Even 50 years down the line, if the same law cannot really apply to us. According to that time, the law said that we can only abort a pregnancy until 20 weeks. But it is safe to get an abortion even after that limit, right? So yes, the law does have its drawbacks most of the times, because it is restrictive to some people, and also because it hasn't been updated in a very long time. Thankfully, an amendment is coming up, and let's hope that it is more inclusive for everyone now. Um, Intersectional barriers are um, um, there. So okay, let me start with this example. So intersectionalities would mean intersectionality means that a person does not have just one kind of discrimination working against them, right? So a Dalit woman who wants an abortion may face more barriers as compared to a higher caste woman who wants an abortion too, purely because this Dalit woman has that extra discrimination acting against them. um, a trans person needing an abortion, the first intersectionality we spoke about was the fact that the law doesn't include them, right? So those additional barriers are created for people when they do have certain other discriminatory systems also working against them, right? So that is what intersectionality means. Now, we spoke so much about these barriers, but what do these barriers lead to? Just because a person wasn't able to go to the hospital because they didn't have enough finances to provide the doctor, formally speaking, then will they just not get an abortion? Will they continue with the pregnancy? That's definitely not true. A person who wants an abortion is going to get that abortion regardless. So when you add barriers to safe abortion, what ends up happening is that the person is pushed into getting an unsafe abortion. What is an unsafe abortion? An unsafe abortion is one which is performed by an untrained provider, okay, under under unhygienic conditions, with inappropriate tools for the gestational age, right? So I'll just kind of explain this in more detail. So when we say untrained provider, it could be a quack, right? When we say unhygienic conditions, it could mean that even if they're using the correct technique, they may not have sterilized their instruments the correct way. They may not be conducting the abortion in a proper hygienic setup in itself. And here we're talking about surgical abortion. Obviously, medical abortion does not require any kind of procedure as such. But yeah, so unhygienic conditions and inappropriate tools would mean using different kind of methods which are not approved medically to um, uh, conduct the abortion. And all of these unsafe abortions are the ones that cause the negative health effects that we have heard associated with abortions since so long. Hemorrhage, sepsis, infections, even death. All of these can be caused by unsafe abortions. Unsafe abortions. When I say unsafe, safe versus unsafe is different from legal versus illegal. Okay, and just to kind of uh, clarify this, I'll give you all an example over here. Um, an unsafe abortion would be conducted by a quack. That is definitely illegal, right? Because the quack is definitely not allowed by law to conduct the abortion. So that unsafe abortion would be illegal. But say, for example, that an OBGYN has conducted an abortion. Okay, it's sort of like a bad example, but um, uh, somebody is conducting, say, there is a person who's conducting an abortion in their own clinic, but they have not been given formal, what is it called, permission by the authorities to conduct abortions in their clinic. But they are following all the rules, like using hygienic conditions and using the correct tools. Then technically that um, abortion would be safe because they are following all of the correct techniques, but that would still be illegal. On the other hand, a person who may be legally conducting an abortion in the hospital but not following the correct techniques would would maybe be conducting unsafe abortion. So illegal and unsafe are not always. A lot of times they are happening in the same case, but they may or may not. Okay. Um, Now, what exactly is how exactly are unsafe abortions conducted? So, unsafe abortions can be of two different types. One is where the unsafe abortion is being provided by an unskilled person, so that would be unsafe. But there's also self-managed abortions which can be unsafe, right? So there are cases where women insert pointed objects like knitting needles or hangers into the uterus per vaginal because they're trying to terminate the pregnancy themselves. Another uh, example is ingesting some kind of abortifacients, some kind of concoctions which have been given to you by some baba or some quack, and they say that you just need to eat this and your abortion will take place. So if it's not, see, we do have medical abortion pills too, but if it has not been approved by the correct authorities, then there's a very good likelihood that the abortion is incomplete and it can lead to complications there. So and then inducing trauma to the abdomen, this is very common, unfortunately. A person with an unwanted pregnancy who is not able to access the abortion in the legal and safe manner, they resort to throwing themselves down the stairs or beating their abdomen repeatedly in order to create that kind of trauma to the abdomen and automatically make the pregnancy to get aborted. These are really sad scenarios. It goes to show that desperate times lead to the kind of desperate measures which can literally harm a person's life. It does not just lead to an infection and doesn't just end over there. It can lead to much severe complications like hemorrhage and sepsis. And when we say this, the number on the right, unsafe abortions are the third leading cause of maternal mortality in India. It's really sad to think about this because it's been 5 decades since our law has legalized abortion access for people, at least for women, and it still remains the third leading cause of maternal mortality. It goes to show that people don't know about the law. If they do, they still can't access it because there's not enough providers over there. Or else, even if they know it and the doctor is available, they can't let people around them know about it, and that is why they choose to use such horrific ways of doing something, and it's not necessary, it's available, it is safe. More than anything, abortions are safe, and they still choose to undergo unsafe abortions and risk their life. you know um, 15.6 million abortions took place in India in 2018, and it just goes to show that um, all of these people who need the abortion are definitely out there. And I'll just end with one quote over here, that there is no such thing as no abortion. There's only safe and unsafe abortions, right? Because if a person does not get the abortion in a safe and legal manner, they will still go to somebody else and get the unsafe one. Okay, thank you so much. I'll pass on to Shweta again.
Hi everyone, I'm back. So regarding the effects on mental health, not just of abortion, but of any unintended pregnancies and how it can impact mental health. The first thing is that it's important to note that none of the options, whether it's adoption, whether it's abortion, whether it's continuing a pregnancy and parenting, is in any way directly harmful to mental health. So there is no such thing that abortions are, traumatic to mental health in any way, or adoption itself is traumatic in mental health, traumatic to mental health in any way. But what is true is that people who face unintended pregnancies, they may experience a greater sense of anxiety and distress because of lack of support from their partner, from their parents, from their family, from their friends, or because of financial stressors, or like Zainab just explained to you, the amount of stigma that exists in society, not just with abortions, but with respect to all unintended pregnancies. So there is definitely there's a lot of fear of judgment, fear of confidentiality breaches. There's fear of just people finding out, and because we've been talking over the last few days how there's so much stigma related to sex itself, and that's kind of where the root of all of this is. And this stigma that is there kind of stays with a person through the whole process of from the point of the unintended pregnancy. So the issue is not the unintended pregnancy. The issue is the way society behaves, the way so many other things that might be completely out of the person's control, and that does not directly mean that an unintended pregnancy can be harmful to mental health. However, because of the amount of judgment that society has and all of it, it can be a very difficult position to be in for pregnant people, especially those from marginalized and vulnerable groups. So when we say that, I'll be using the example of abortion because then I've just explained the barriers really well. But we recognize that there are a lot of barriers to seeking abortion services. But when it comes to being a young unmarried girl, if you are a trans man, if you are a person living with disabilities, all of these identities can make it even more difficult to access healthcare services, to also access legal services, and all of this can complicate the decision that a person would make. In an ideal world, one person should be able to choose any of those three options. But right now, because of a lot of limitations out of control, whether it's a legal limitation by, say abortion cannot be done after 20 weeks, people are forced to choose other options. And we would rather work towards a world where people are free to kind of choose each of those three options, whatever they feel is the best fit for them. And one common theme to all the three options available is when a person experiences an unintended pregnancy, that no matter whichever route they choose, whether it's parenting or adoption or abortion, if they have made that decision for themselves, free from any coercion, free from being forced into an option or being pushed into a corner, there is relief and happiness that they report. And this is something that is really important to consider, that again, the issue is not the unintended pregnancy. It's really important, as I wrap up, to remember that no one else can make the pregnant person's decision for them or imply that one option is a better solution than another. Every unintended pregnancy exists in its own unique vacuum of situations. There might be some people who are financially well off, some people who are financially not. There might be some people who are married, some people who are not. There might be some people who have completed their family, some people who have not. And this situation can vary from person to person, situation to situation. So there is no one, if you fit A, B, C, then you go for parenting. If you fit B, C, D, you go for adoption. There is no such single fit like that. So it's really important to know that. Again, people who experience unintended pregnancies should be supported in their decision, especially now that we know the kind of barriers that they can face. So as they navigate all of the different options, as they decide what is best for them, they should be supported. They should be loved. They should be cared for. And it's very important that people's own personal judgment is kept aside, and that pregnant people are empowered to make this decision in a manner that's keeping what's best for them. It is completely possible to disagree with abortion entirely for yourself, while at the same time supporting a friend or a partner who may choose to have an abortion. Things like that. And each option can have a own variety of experiences that, can be traumatic because of the various barriers that we've spoken about today. So if a pregnant person, after, experiencing any of these options, whether it's parenting, whether it is adoption, whether it's abortion, if they have any negative emotions, any anxiety, any distress that they are going through, it is important that they be supported. And this support is of course great if it comes in the form of familial or partner support or parental support, but sometimes that's not possible. So and sometimes professional help is needed. So there's always the option of counseling and being supported through those routes. There are also support groups that exist for with other people who have gone through similar experiences, similar emotions, and all of this kind of ensures that people are supported and kind of just accepted through whatever decision they make for themselves. So as we wrap up, I'll just give you some basic take-home messages for today, because we do know that a lot of you plan to kind of talk about these issues later on through sex education systems. So just some basic take-home messages, and then Zainab will come in again at the end. The first thing is that a pregnancy can be unintended for a variety of reasons, and this can depend on a whole multitude of factors. People who face unintended pregnancies have three main options. There's parenting, adoption, and abortion. Pregnancy and unintended pregnancies are not solely a woman's issue. Non-cisgender people may also get pregnant if they have the capability to gestate. People can have a variety of beliefs about the ethics and morality of these options, and they're often based on the various values that they've inculcated growing up and over time, whether it's religious, cultural, family, or just personal experiences. Deciding whether or not to continue a pregnancy can be a complicated process owing to external factors as well as one's own values about the same. And some people may decide that they are able to continue their pregnancies and become parents. They may choose to do this alone or in a relationship. And it's important to have a discussion and think about the commitment that bringing up a child requires when choosing this option. Adoption is the second option, which involves placing the child with people who will raise the child as their own. Then there's abortions. Safe abortions are one of the safest medical procedures. An abortion is safe when it's performed by a trained provider under aseptic conditions with the right tools for the gestational age. Safe abortions do not have any long-term health effects. There are different methods of safe abortions, which could be medical in the form of pills, or surgical, which involves evacuation of the uterus and evacuation of the products of conception. Ultimately, it's important that no one can force a pregnant person to continue a pregnancy or to terminate it. It is solely the decision of the pregnant person. The choice that they make is entirely valid. people facing unintended pregnancies are not in this alone. A lot of people experience unintended pregnancies, but only few actually talk about it. Spaces like this give us the opportunity to bring out how common it actually is. There are many different avenues that one can take to find support and love that they need during their pregnancy and decision making process. One should never be afraid to reach out for help. With that, we're done. Zainab will just briefly talk to you all about what ISAY really does, and yeah, then we're done.
Okay. Hello everyone. Once again, just to give you all a brief idea as to what our organization is about. ISAY stands for India Safe Abortion Youth Advocates, and we are the country advocacy network for India, and we work under the parent organization of ASAP, that is Asia Safe Abortion Youth Partnership. Asia Safe Abortion Partnership. And we are the country advocacy network for ASAP. So there are other networks like similar to ours in most of the Asian countries around us: Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, all of those countries. So within ISAY, we are specifically a group of medical students who have come together and currently work in Mumbai, and we talk sen- um, about creating a more sensitive medical, community for ourselves. We realize that there's a lot of discrimination, a lot of insensitivity that is propagated by the medical system themselves, and we majorly our work majorly surrounds conducting workshops for medical students, where we talk about gender, sex, sexuality, contraception, and then eventually how all of these connect to sexual and reproductive health and rights for women, and how that eventually then has effects on abortion and its access. And we strive to create a more sensitive group of medical students around us. And we also, so workshops is one of the major ways that we do our work, but we also have a very active social media account. You can see on the bottom of your screens, we are on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. At ISAY Advocates is our handle everywhere. And you can approach us if you want to know more about any of these topics, if you want to attend our workshop, and you can follow our pages if you want to find out more about the upcoming amendments, about the different, small issues that do come up, and then we put them up on our page. Um, this is what ISAY is about in brief, and I think this is where we end. Thank you so much.
So we'll be having a question answer round right now, and Simran will be joining us for it.
Hi.
Hi.
So there were a few questions for you all. Am I audible?
Yeah.
So in cases where there is an unplanned pregnancy and the pregnant girl is left as a single mother, can she put up the child for adoption singly?
Yeah, so this is a nice question. She can. So if the surrendering parent, again, the language of the law, not me, but if the surrendering parent is an unmarried mother, then the deed of surrender can be executed as long as there's a single female member of the like committee that is present and they're just like witnessing it. But even if you're a single mother, it's possible to do it. And so if it's like you're single because of death of the spouse, then you're asked to provide like a death certificate just to kind of show that. And if the other partner is kind of not around, then there's this term under the clause which is kind of problematic called as abandoned child. So if one parent is not there, it's kind of considered as an abandoned child. And that's kind of what they have a separate set of procedure for that they follow. But of course, extremely problematic language on the law.
Okay, thank you. So in cases where there is an unplanned pregnancy and the girl is okay, this is already done, I think. What are the policies or laws to support her?
So, as far as I know, there's no explicit law to generally support single mothers, apart from clauses within these other laws regarding other issues that makes provision for it. Increasingly, we are seeing that there is acceptance of the fact that people don't need to be in a couple or like in a relationship to opt for any of these options. So even like within like when if it's regarding placing a child in adoption, it's possible to do that as a single mother. If it's regarding abortion, it's possible to do that as a single mother. But there's no, as far as I know, I mean, related to these two specific laws, there's no extra protections apart from that already there for everyone else.
And if the father wants to keep the child, but the mother wants to abort, so what should be done in such a situation?
So according to the law, only the consent of the pregnant person is required. Only the woman is needed to consent. Definitely, this is something to discuss by the couple themselves. Okay, and there is a lot of debate around the fact that this is what should the male partner do if the woman doesn't want to undergo with the pregnancy. But if we need to kind of remember that the pregnancy has to be supported by the woman in the end, and the male partner can try to have a conversation with their partner and try to put down their facts, but in the end the final say has to be the woman, because it is her body and she has to undergo the stresses, whether it is physical or mental, of the pregnancy. And that is something we kind of continuously forget when we say that the male partner needs to have a say. Yeah.
That's great answer. So, okay, what if the parents opting for abortion are themselves RMPs? Like, are they allowed to register their own opinion?
Yeah, so there's nothing explicitly in the law that says that RMPs cannot opine for themselves. But I mean, it sounds like a weird idea if you think about it, right? That it's kind of a loophole in the law. And actually, it's one of many loopholes that do exist in the law. So yes, they could write a prescription for themselves if they want to, and they can opine. But if anyone say happens to bring it up in court of law, I'm not sure if that would stand. And yeah, so that's the general situation.
If both the parents, like the pregnant person and the partner, are unmarried, and is the witness still required from the pregnant person's family only?
This is regarding adoption. I think it had come earlier when I was talking. So yeah, so essentially this is what is called as a child born out of wedlock, right? Because they're unmarried, but they are a couple. So
Yeah.
in that case, it's still only the pregnant person or the mother in quotations who can surrender the child. And if the mother is a minor, as in is less than the age of 18, then it would require like the legal guardian or parent to be there, which is anyway the situation if you are even married and a minor. So yeah.
Should abortion be done at home? Like, isn't it dangerous if the products of contraception do not get released?
So this is being debated right now a lot, because self-managed abortions are being advocated by a lot of abortion advocates right now, because of the obvious barriers that we spoke about. There's a lot of issues with access. So, if you look at the statistics, even on the WHO site, it has been said that there is no difference if a person uses medical abortion at home or like self manages the abortion. So they do say, they have done a research on it. There is no difference in the results in the end. But what are the there is still a lot of evidence that lacks to support that same thing. So like it's to be really specific, it's a low level of evidence, something like that. So according to that, like it is there, it is an option, it is Definitely not something you can get very easily over the counter without prescriptions, which is why you would kind of need to go to a doctor in the end. But it is still possible and it is still safe because it has a 95% efficacy. So technically, yes.
Also, if a pregnant person realizes that they are pregnant when they miss their first period, so that's within the first month, then is there any safe way for them to get the abortion done at home without visiting the doctor?
Yeah, so like I just said, there are options where they can do it, but again there's a sort of added sort of disclaimer to this, that any kind of medication that you do at home has to be done only if you have complete information to that. Access to that information is very important. Understanding what are the normal effects of that medication and what would come under the side effects, and what under those side effects would be something severe enough that you would then need to go to a doctor. If that information is available to a person, then it is possible for them to do the abortion at home. Now, I'd like to add a little bit over here, because there is something like telemedicine which is coming up in the world right now, especially with the lockdown. We're seeing this, that doctors can, consult over the phone and over video calls, and that is something that is being used for abortion because there's not a lot of tests that are required. You can get a pregnancy test kit at home and you can confirm the pregnancy like that, and the doctor can ask you about your the last menstrual period and figure out the gestational age accordingly. So telemedicine is a possibility, and it's a very interesting approach to medical abortion and can really ease access for a lot of people. And there's also this other there's something known as women on web, I think, which provides abortions directly online, and that is also one of the options. If somebody wants, they can check out their website. It's really interesting.
Okay, so there are two more questions that have just come up. What are the rights of surrogate mothers?
Okay, so I'm assuming this is within the legal context in India. So I just did some quick reading up about it. So in India, since December 2018, actually surrogacy laws changed. So until then, surrogacy was like a very big booming market in our country. But then the laws kind of changed. Now commercial surrogacy isn't a thing anymore, like that's banned, and the only way in which a person can kind of be a surrogate is if they're doing it, out of what they call altruistic or like humanistic reasons, that it's for the good of like society or whatever. So in case if there's an infertile couple and they're really trying, and then they can do it. And some of the restrictions that are placed is that the person who will be the surrogate, they can only be a surrogate once, and they can only be the surrogate if they're a close relative of the parents, and if that person is already married and has a child. So there's I think a lot of assumptions also that kind of come with it. But yeah, that's the current situation, so it's quite restricted now, but yeah.
Can a person who is unmarried adopt a child in India?
Okay, I can take that question. So yes, they can. Marital status is not a kind of limiting factor to adoption. So irrespective of marital status and irrespective of gender, people can adopt children. The issue though is that, I mean, not an issue, but one kind of clause that kind of comes in there is that if it is a single female adopting, then they can adopt child of either gender. But if it's a single male, then they can only adopt male children and not female children. At least that's what the law states. So yeah.
Also, you were telling about telemedicine. So, what about ectopic pregnancies, like if online abortion is done without USG?
Zainab, we are not audible.
You're not audible.
Sorry. I okay. So when it comes to an ectopic pregnancy, I think if I'm remembering it right, we do use the same pills anyway. So for the abortion for what, okay, wait, let me rephrase that properly. First of all, if this is being done online, the doctor will definitely be asking history, and if there is an ectopic pregnancy, there would be signs for it anyway. So there's a very good chance that the doctor will pick up on that. Okay, and that is why, it is said that you should still consult with the doctor. But even in the case where it is not, where something like this may happen, the doctor usually does ask the person to kind of note what kind of products were expelled when they did have the bleeding, and to report back to them about it. So this is something, which is kind of caught properly. If not enough contents come out, and if something does stay back, then the doctor will figure that out even after, later on during the follow-up visit. And there's also this thing where some places they do a follow-up USG to check in a medical abortion if all of the products have come out. So in surgical cases, obviously, when you do the whole procedure, you can see what kind of products have come out, and you can understand that everything came out. But in medical, they do sometimes opt for a follow-up USG.
Somebody's asked that how does a woman undergo abortion if pregnancy occurs due to contraceptive failure, as only married women can undergo abortion if pregnancy occurs due to contraceptive failure?
Okay, so that's actually a really nice question. And this is where we kind of question the law again. So if you see, there are 4 clauses. So the married woman clause related to contraceptive failure only applies to the contraceptive failure clause. But there are still clauses related to physical health, mental health. I mean, harm to the physical and mental health of the pregnant person, harm to the physical and mental health of the fetus, and also the so there are like 4 clauses. Okay, and one thing that so the issue that kind of comes up is that the law puts the power in the hand of the doctors to kind of look at the law and kind of then see where this unmarried woman would kind of fit into it. One really nice way of looking at it is that if it's an unintended pregnancy, if the person has made a decision and chosen abortion, continuing it then could be harmful to mental health. And under that clause, you can kind of provide it. Doctors are not really questioned about it, but it does kind of bring up the issue that it's still not a choice and you have to kind of, go through that whole process. So, yeah.
Okay. There's
Thank
one
you.
last question that has come up. If consulted by telemedicine due to abortion, how should the products of pregnancy which are expelled to be disposed safely?
So when a person has undergone a medical abortion, as I said, it's very similar to having a period. It's just bleeding for them, right? And it isn't something that, like a whole fetus comes out of ऐसे कुछ, it doesn't happen. And you really just expel it the way you would otherwise. So there's not much to it. It's just blood which comes out.
Thank you so much, Zainab and Shweta.
Thank you.
That's all the questions that we have now. If there's anything else that you guys want to ask, please drop them on the group or mail them to us so that you can take over.
Thanks, Zanab and Shweta. It was an excellent presentation and we really learned a lot. Thank you for giving us time. And thank you to everybody for joining us on this session. And yes, it's not over yet. And we have one more day of this activity left. Please don't forget to join us tomorrow. And for the participants who have registered, they have an activity on WhatsApp, which has been planned by ISAE. Don't forget to join that. We are starting it just in a while. Thank you.